everybody, to Proverbs, God's ancient wisdom for our modern world. I'm your host, James Chapman. This morning we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 5, warnings against adultery. Let's jump right in and see what Proverbs has to say. All right, let's get started. Verses 1 and 2. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Turn your ear to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion and your lips may preserve knowledge. Once again, we see the father pleading with his sons to lean in and listen to what he is trying to teach them. He tries to let them know the critical nature of what he's trying to teach them and what he wants them to do with the truth he's attempting to impart. He understands the consequences of the failure to accept and act upon this most crucial of subjects. Since Solomon is the author of most of Proverbs, he was probably a witness to the devastating results of his father's adultery with Bathsheba. So he has a sense of urgency when it comes to seeing his sons avoid this terrible family and life-destroying act. He understands that it affects everything in your life and can strip you of discretion and pull you away from living a life filled with God's truth. So, how does the Father describe the adulterous woman? Well, we read in verses 3 and 4, "For the lips of the adulterous woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end, she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword." Now here we see the contrast between the perception and the reality. Now the act of adultery looks pleasant and enticing. I mean, she sounds so alluring. She says things that flatter your ego, things that inflame your fleshly desires. She looks beautiful. She smells so wonderful. But her appearance is as deliberate as the appearance of a soldier who puts on his body armor. The soldier's purpose is to survive a battle. The dress, makeup, perfume, and speech of an adulterous woman are also designed for a purpose. That is, to capture a man and fulfill her own sensual desires, without any real concern for any man she entraps, without any consideration of the consequences for her, her husband, and children, or the wife and children of her victim. And as beautiful as she appears, and as tempting as the situation looks, the final outcome is always a disaster. Bitter as gall and sharp as a double-edged sword is how the writer described the actual consequences. Now, these are not terms we see much, so let's just look and examine what they mean. Gall, also known as bile, is a bitter liquid produced by the gallbladder, and it is used to aid digestion in the intestines. It is nasty, and certainly not something you would want to consume. But gall also brings to mind resentment, rudeness, shameless behavior, and many other bad behaviors. Now, what is being described as gall is actually significant emotional and mental distress, pain, suffering, and regret. And all this from what looked so good at first. And a, quote, double-edged sword, well, that would be the equivalent of the primary weapon of a modern soldier. A weapon which is designed with the sole purpose of inflicting maximum damage with minimum effort. This is an excellent description of the result of an extramarital affair. It inflicts devastating consequences to all involved. It destroys trust. It crushes love and compassion. It even hurts those not involved. When a marriage dissolves due to adultery, the children in both families involved are often the ones who suffer the most. We talked about the statistics of a single parent family in our last podcast, and it won't hurt to review them once again. You see, the children in a single parent home are 5 times more likely to commit suicide, 9 times more likely to drop out of high school, 10 times more likely to take drugs, 20 times more likely to end up in prison, and 32 times more likely to run away from home. There is no good conclusion to adultery. This is why you find warnings against it throughout the scriptures. What else does this passage have to say about the adulterous woman? Well, in verses 5 and 6, we read, "Her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths wander aimlessly, but she does not know it." In the times when the Proverbs was written, there was actually a death penalty for adultery, and it applied to both the woman and the man involved. This was how serious this act was considered. The Hebrew nation, governed by God's laws, recognized the catastrophic nature of this sin, which didn't just harm the sinner, but destroyed entire families. Well, we don't have these laws today, but the results of adultery are still just as destructive in our, quote, modern society as they were back then. Adultery increases the chances of acquiring an STD. When a breakup occurs, the chances of violence are increased. To support the illicit relationship, the funds used must be hidden from the spouse, causing financial hardship and a violation of trust to the non-offending partner. And since between 40 and 60% of all marriages today result in divorce, we need to look at the impact of the family after the family dies. Now, the legal process of getting a divorce alone can cost thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars. And then, with only half your previous income, you both will need to find housing. Well, good luck with that when the median home cost in the U.S., according to the National Association of Realtors, is around $387,000. And of course, there's also alimony and child support to consider. Well, in short, there is no plus side to adultery. It destroys your health, your reputation, your marriage, your spouse, your children, and your finances. No wonder Proverbs 22:14 says, "A man who is under God's curse falls into it." In verse 6, we see just how blind those who commit adultery can be. Sometimes they have no understanding of this, quote, way of life. They appear ignorant of God's truth and the ways of wisdom. Now, with this, quote, blindness, they wander through life oblivious to their sin and uncaring of the harm they cause. But really, how ignorant are they? And how unaware of the consequences of their acts? After all, a righteous God won't hold you responsible if you are unaware of your offenses, would he? Well, Romans reminds us that all people are without excuse. For it says, "Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." And Romans continues, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their hearts were darkened." See, the truth is that at one time they knew right from wrong, and over time made choices to do wrong. Now, the reasons don't really matter, and mitigating circumstances, don't excuse these choices. And over time, their consciences became darkened and they no longer cared about following anything but the impulses of their lustful hearts. This is the kind of person we should be aware of. And as an ambassador of God, be willing to minister to and be ready to share the good news of the gospel. But we must also exercise caution, for she or he is an unwitting tool of the enemy, and we still have a fleshly nature which can be enticed. So, how do we deal with her? Well, let's take a look at verses 7 through 10, where we read, "Now then, my sons, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say. Keep to a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you lose your honor to others, and your dignity to one who is cruel, lest strangers feast on your wealth, and your toil enrich the house of another." Once again, we see this pattern of reasons, commands, and consequences. The Father says, first of all, listen to me. And second, don't turn away. You see, he wants his son to learn what to do at his feet instead of learning by his mistakes. Now, this is always the best way, but unfortunately for most of us, it's not the way we choose to learn. And it is true that, quote, pain is an excellent teacher, unquote. But you would think that more of us would choose a gentler instructor. And the father also wants his son to follow his guidance. Of course. What father would want his child to suffer the consequences of adultery? To go through the agony of having to see their lives just torn apart? No father that I could think of, unless they are just cruel and without mercy. So what does the father suggest as the method to keep his son safe? Well, two things. First, keep to a path far from her. And two, do not go near the door of her house. We see the concept of the path again. The father says the son should not make the same types of choices that got the woman to the place where she has no problem committing adultery. The son should make wise choices about things like where he goes, who he spends time with, and, in our modern society, what he watches on social media. You see, the son should choose to develop good, wholesome relationships. He should seek companionship in ways and at places which minimize the opportunities to indulge in the desires of his lower impulses. He should choose to ensure he gives adequate opportunities for his spirit to be fed and strengthened by reading the scriptures and being with God in prayer. In short, the son is being encouraged to seek God and avoid evil. It's really a fairly simple formula, one which will help us avoid not just adultery, but many problems in life. Now, as for the consequences, he says you are going to lose your honor to others, your dignity to one who is cruel, strangers will feast on your wealth, and your toil will enrich others. Wow, this is a perfect description of the fallout caused by adultery. First, at least this used to be true, you lose your reputation and dignity. Even though this is less important in our society for the most part, since our liberal culture has almost normalized divorce. It has stripped away the stigma it once had. However, many still understand that unless corrected, the attitudes and behaviors which caused the divorce will follow the man and the woman into their next relationship and repeat itself again. And you also lose your good name to someone who has no problem ensuring it stays ruined. That is, someone who's cruel. Now, in the time of the Proverbs, word of mouth was sufficient to destroy your good name. Society was smaller then. But today, with the internet, the ways of crushing you are exponentially increased. It can ruin not just your future relationships, it can also impact your ability to even gain decent employment. And finally, we see what we've already discussed once, the financial impact. Specifically, what you had earned, your wealth, is consumed by lawyers, social workers, and all the other expenses incurred by divorce. And your future earnings, your toil, will be given to those outside your family. What will we eventually have to say when it comes to adultery? Will we say, it was worth it, or I have no regrets? Perhaps, it was the best time of my life. Let's learn the truth from verses 11 through 14, where we read, at the end of your life, you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. You will say, how I hated discipline, how my heart spurned correction. I would not obey my teachers or turn my ear to my instructors, and I was soon in serious trouble in the assembly of God's people. The truth seems to show that there is significant regret. Even though the son had been taught, he hated the good advice he was given. And when he was rebuked or spurned, he rejected any attempt to cease the harmful choices he was making. And that's probably because he was still in that short period where the sin that he was committing was causing him pleasure. Well, all the trouble he faced was, inevitable, severe, and public. That we would learn from the mistakes of others and heed wise counsel. But in our United States culture, our movies, TV, and social media, they all downplay the consequences and even glorify adultery. We are told that you can get away with it. You cannot. We are told the consequences are minor. They are not. We are told you can hide it. You can not. Actions have consequences. Even physics tells us that actions have an equal and opposite reaction. Our choices and activities will yield results, and we get to choose, and we get to decide what those results will be. So, what should we do? What choices should we make? How can we meet the needs for companionship and intimacy which God has placed in all of us? We find the answers to those questions in verses 15 through 21, where we read, drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breasts satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Why, my son, be intoxicated with another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? For your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths. Now, don't let the poetic language here fool you. This is actually pretty specific, very intimate advice. The well and cistern, well, they refer to your wife. It teaches us that sexual relations are to be fulfilled and enjoyed in the context of an exclusive relationship called marriage, never shared in the streets or public squares. This passage encourages you to be thrilled with the relationship you enjoy with your wife and to be satisfied in what you two alone can share. I mean, God created us as sexual beings, and He knows, as the Creator, the best way for that to be used. Trust Him. He knows what He's doing. And we are again given a warning to keep it private and exclusive. When you take intimacy outside of marriage, even if it is never discovered or only in your thoughts, God is still watching. He knows your thoughts. And even if they are not acted on, in His eyes, and they are the ones that count, you have still committed adultery. So, let's make the choice to be thrilled with the wife of our youth and be satisfied by her. Now, for some final words about the condition of those who choose the wrong path, let's read verses 22 and 23, where we see it says, "The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of their sins hold them fast. For lack of discipline, they will die, led astray by their own great folly." Here we see the reality of living a life in opposition to the eternal truths of life that God is trying to reveal to us in Proverbs. Life is not really as different as we would like to think. You see, our modern society has not nullified the reality that errors create negative results. What was true 5,000 years ago about mankind, our nature, our relationships, and even truth itself is still true today. What we view as just living a life which is pleasing to ourselves is really a snare and a trap which controls, confines, and enslaves. When we refuse to listen to wise counsel, reject correction, and continue down a life filled by willfulness and selfish choices, it is not being independent and strong. It is folly and leads to the ultimate destruction of all you ever hoped to accomplish in life. It leads to an empty life and a sad, premature death. Well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast where we discuss Proverbs, God's ancient wisdom for our modern world. Hope to see you again all next week. Bye for now.